We are jumping straight in tonight, and I'm really, really glad that everybody is here. Last week was so powerful in a lot of different ways because I really believe that God moved in a way that only God can move. And as we start to turn the corner into tonight, I'm expecting the same exact thing. And I believe that through our conversation that we're going to have over the next few minutes, I hope and pray that you are able to leave tonight with some really clear, really practical things that you can apply in how you think. But before we jump into that, we have something really, really big to celebrate that happened last night at UNCW. 12 wins in a row, people. Let me tell you something. I wasn't able to go last night, but I was having FOMO to the fullest extent last night. I am proud of our UNCW basketball team. What? Go Hawks! One more time, come on. Makes me so happy. If you were here last week, you know that we are in a conversation on mental health like Jake and Jenna just talked about. Tonight, like we mentioned, we're going to jump into a conversation, but I want to remind you of a couple things that we covered last week before we jump into the conversation and really begin to lay a foundation for us to kind of go off of tonight. And one is we made a couple promises to each other. And if you weren't here last week, you're about to make me a promise that I would really love for you to mean with every bit of your being. We can put this on the screen, but I asked you to promise me three things. One, to keep going. Two, to invite someone in. And three, to go easy on you. When it comes to mental health, we have got to do these three things. And I was talking to my friend the other day, Mr. Zach Hamby, everybody. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was talking to Zach, and he said, hey, I think that it would be really good just to remind everybody that just because we've had one part of the conversation on mental health and we don't feel like results immediately taking shape, we've still got to keep going. Even if we came to community groups on Thursday night and we entered into the conversation and we practiced vulnerability and we stepped into deeper connection and we still don't feel 100% healthy, that is perfectly normal and that is okay. But you've got to keep going. And we made you some promises as well. We said that we're going to give you unconditional support. We're going to be real with you. And we're going to talk about a hopeful, holistic approach. And that's where we talked about how sometimes in the context of church, it can feel like you come in, you go, hey, I'm struggling with mental health, or I'm struggling to engage in the conversation. And somebody looks at you and goes, oh, you'll be okay. Just trust God. Just check all the boxes. We want to go deeper than that. We believe that there is an immense amount of depth to the conversation around mental health, especially when it comes to the church. And I really believe that God wants to say something very specific to you tonight, but we can't afford to jump into the conversation and think that we're going to walk out of this room with a ton of perfect solutions. We are not God, right? We are learning this too. So one thing that really, really encouraged me as I was researching over the past couple of weeks is a poet, Antonio Machado, said this: "Traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking, beat by beat, and verse by verse." And I think this is so helpful when we think about mental health. We are, in a lot of ways, pioneers in this subject. Not in the way that we're going to have perfect answers necessarily, but we are blazing a path. We are taking this beat by beat and verse by verse. And that's what we're going to do through our conversation tonight. I would love it if you have your Bibles, you can jump to 2 Corinthians. Paul says some things to the church in Corinth as he gets ready to kind of wrap up his second letter to them. And it's kind of like I would consider this section of 2 Corinthians as Paul's final thoughts. And I think that that's really important because it underlines the vast importance of what he said. In chapter 10, verse 3, we can jump in here really quick. He says, "We are human, but we don't wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. And this part's really important. We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. And this is the picture. The thoughts that pop up into our mind, the thoughts that we struggle with on a daily basis. Jesus gives us a clear invitation in his life that we can take our thoughts and we can say, no, you have got to obey the authority and the love of Jesus. So that's where we're starting tonight. And two of my favorite people in the world are going to participate in this conversation. So can we please give a really, really loud, warm welcome to Mike and to Maddie. Let's go. Come on.
Hey, Car.
Go.
Carby.
Y'all know that's what Mike calls me, right?
I think it.
Oh, you didn't get out? I'm wearing my girl dad. And Lennon's on the stage tonight.
Yeah, look at her. She's
How
chilling.
fun is that?
Kind of looks like a bunch of burritos, but it's totally fine.
No, it does not. To dive into the conversation, kind of jumping off of 2 Corinthians, Mike and Maddie, I would love to be able to hear from you for just a moment on how you've helped me in my journey of mental health. And I talked about this a little bit last week, but I would tell you, and I'm totally okay talking about this because I believe that it's really important to model what it looks like to be vulnerable and for us to continue to be kind of in the know as to where we are as we are leading through this conversation. I would say that I struggle with depression. I battle thoughts that would kind of come underneath the heading of depression very consistently. I would tell you that I really do struggle with insecurity. And I told you last week that starting the conversation on mental health sent all of my insecure triggers haywire in my brain. And I think that what's really helpful is about the three of us having this conversation is Maddie and Mike, y'all have been so helpful to me as I have been processing what does it look like to live in the joy of the Lord, to live in the confidence of the Lord, to allow myself to trust and to believe what he says about me and not what the world says about me. And Mike, for you and I, that's looked like we've gone to a lot of coffees together where I have verbally processed, all of what I'm struggling with, and you've had to rein me in. And Maddie, you get a front row seat. Last night, we were at dinner, and I was going on and on and on about something, and Maddie was like, hold on, take a breath, hey, think about it this way, hey, let's come back. And it's just so helpful. So do y'all have anything embarrassing about me that you would like to share? I'm just kidding, unless you want to. But can you
Later.
share a little bit about what that has been like? And you can really share anything because I believe that it's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we are one big family sitting up here. And so one thing I just want to extend is that this family actually gets extended out this way. And so I hope that you guys feel that tonight, this has nothing to do with what you just asked me.
No, you're good.
But I hope you guys feel that tonight, you just really get an invitation into a conversation that we're all a part of. And when I say all of us, it's not just the three of us, it's all of us. And I hope you feel that family tonight from us, because at first I was like, are you kidding me? I have to talk about my mental health, not just with my husband, who knows me very well, but my dad. Are you serious? And what I'm realizing though is it's these are the people in my life, and your life might look different, that we have consistent conversation with that I believe is vital and important, and they ask vital questions. And you push in on me more than I push on you, probably. And so it's just so helpful to have these people. And I'm just extending my hand. If you don't have these people, welcome. We're here.
Yeah, that's good.
So.
So there were very mixed motives in having coffees. It's keep your friends close and the people who date your daughters even closer.
All right.
For a long time, you held the fact that you had a background check on me.
Oh, and lots of
because I was working here, and he's like, I have a background check.
Lots of connections that could make you disappear.
Did y'all hear that?
No, that's sorry. No,
Make
but
you
this
disappear?
But I want to tell you because there's something you said, and one is it's really a privilege to be here tonight. I just love what Overflow is and what it does. And part of what you need to understand is that you guys have been really dealt a really, really tough start to your college career. Not only because of COVID, that's a big part of it, because it's just everything has just been madness, and you've got so many layers of decisions in the beginning. But you go back into you guys have grown up with social media. You have grown up with basically an unfiltered avalanche of information, images, viewpoints, most of them that aren't cohesive in any sort of that produce any kind of sanity. And so then you get into you've got that, and then I think on top of that you have this subtle sense of fear that just kind of runs underneath everything, that anytime you struggle or think something or feel something, that this is the end, and now you're going to struggle with this for the rest of your life, or this is sort of your curse or your sentence. And I remember, Carson, we were talking, and I think it was right before you guys got married, and you told me that you were really struggling with just these really dark thoughts and kind of in this really dark place, depression, and those are the language you used. I remember the first thought in your head, like from my perspective, is you do get afraid. You're like, oh gosh, here we go. And then I realized I have to believe the same thing about you that I believe for myself, and that we believe about what God actually says. And that is you validate it because it's a real thing. Like it's not that you're crazy, it's a real thing. Mm-hmm. Things happen in the world, things happen in our own sort of souls, inside of our own selves, that cause this thing to happen. And then what you have to do is you reach out and you process and you listen and you share, and then to encourage, though, isn't to give like a quick solution. It's to try and enter in, and then to give vision for the way you can take a step and the next step and the next step and the next step. Depression and anxiety and things like that are fundamentally, they affect our perception of things. Because if you've ever struggled, you know that no matter how good someone tells you something is, you can't see it, right? That's the whole problem. It feels dark. So they're perceptions. And then when you overlay or you underlay what I believe, the reality of the gospel and God's goodness to us, it actually teaches us that we walk by faith and not by, what does it say? Right, so there's something else underneath this. And I think that's one of the big connections. We'll make that tonight. But that was when it was. It wasn't about trying to fix Carson so you'd be good to marry my daughter. It was about, okay, how do we walk through this in a way that I think honors you, honors the struggle in such a way that it doesn't have a stronghold like you read earlier, but that you actually get to experience something of God and His redemptive work in you for the sake of what lies ahead.
That's good. So, yeah, I really do believe that you both have been so helpful at calling it. Going, hey, Carson, you need to look over here. Hey, you need to help yourself kind of get back to this place where you're listening to the voice of the Lord. You're walking by faith, not just by what you see or what you perceive. And that has been a consistent walk over the past almost 10 years. Mm-hmm. And that has led our relationships to be some of the most obviously formative relationships in my life. And I wanted to make a point about this in the beginning of the conversation because this is so important. Like, it's so important for you to have people in your life that can say things to you, that can push you, that can encourage you, that can say, hey, look over here, or hey, let me just help you keep your chin up a little bit. So I want you to know, if you don't have somebody in your life that kind of meets that description, you've gotta, because they need you and you need them. And God wants to use them to be a part of your story. And I think one of the things that you guys help me do very consistently is practicing stillness, because I love to kind of push through. I'm like, oh, if I'm hurting or I've got a problem, like I'll just kind of work my way through it and just kind of grin and bear it until I get to the other side. And if you were here last week, one of the landing ideas, well, we've got to find a rhythm of stillness, because it's in that place that we can really begin to surrender some of our thoughts and like know some of the things that we're thinking and begin to make them obedient to Christ. But stillness can feel really intimidating, because it's like, I don't want to get alone with my thoughts because I don't know how that's going to treat my brain, or I don't know how that's going to treat the way that I feel. And Maddie, you have some thoughts on this that I think are really, really helpful, and a quote that I think would be just like really clear and helpful to start with.
Yeah, so I think stillness is something that, if we're getting gut level honest, we're all a little afraid of, because the second, and we talked about this, I was talking to Zach earlier about at fall weekend, is that we run at a pace, oftentimes that we don't, it goes unchecked, so we don't even realize, but some of us run at a pace like that to keep us from getting still, to stop and to go, I actually don't have it together, I'm not going to address it, so I'm going to keep going. Or my thoughts are dark, but you know what? If I fill my schedule from sun up to sundown, I don't have to address it. I don't have to tell anyone. I don't have to let anyone in. And so I also want to make the distinction between stillness and alone. Because stillness is something that, gosh, it's something that settles you. It's something that grounds you. Being alone, well, first of all, you're never alone. You aren't alone. And if there's something that you walk away with tonight that's nothing but, I am not alone in this, I want you to hear that. And so I love this idea of stillness because it allows us to do what we'll talk later, like a thought inventory with our thoughts. But it also allows the voice of God, like Carson talked last week, to meet you in a whisper in those moments. And so this comes from Strahan Coleman. If you're familiar with Commoner's Communion, does anyone know Commoner's Communion? It's very poetic. I love liturgies, so if this is not your style, I just want you to hear this. It says this: we may not always be able to control our anxiety, our fear, or our shame, but we can allow those things to magnetize us towards God rather than push us away. Allowing our every thought, be it good or be it bad, wander into God. It can become an intentional revolution against that push. At first, it can feel awkward and vulnerable. I'm here to say that it will. Even jarring. Something you're not used to is going to feel jarring. To invite an awareness of God into our dark moments. But with practice, that movement can become liberating and over time reflexive. Every thought and emotion can flow toward God because the ocean of his love is grand enough to engulf and transform our inner world without his ever taking offense or being wounded, because after all, he is the great mind healer. And I know that I have sat across from people who have said, well, just cast your anxiety, which, yes, that's scripture. But there's a reason that God tells us to cast our anxiety. And so I think that this helps me see that what God wants for me is to pull all of my thoughts and put it onto him and go, God, I'm gonna make this flow towards you, if that makes sense. I want this to be underneath your authority. And I used to hide and run from God when I felt those dark thoughts and when I felt that anxiety, because I thought, no, I don't want God to know that either I'm dealing with that, which, hello, he does, or I thought I was ashamed, so I didn't even want to address it. So getting alone with God, I wouldn't do it because I thought that he would be mad that I didn't have enough faith, and so I was feeling anxious. And what I realized was the faith was actually, God, I trust you enough to bring my anxiety to you and to let my thoughts go towards you instead of going, well, you must be a bad Christian or you must not have enough faith if you're feeling this way. That's not the answer. That's not what this is saying. And so I love that God's just never going to be offended. He's never going to be offended by our anxious thoughts or our dark thoughts.
Yeah, that's good. I think that leads us to this idea that our mental health and our spiritual life are made to be connected. And for a long time, I think that we could very easily begin to see those two things as separate. Like, I need to get my thoughts to a healthy place, or I need to get my mental health to a sustainable place before I begin to live out my faith. But it's actually the opposite. It's like you're living out your faith. You were talking about this on Sunday with that idea of fear and trembling. Like, I'm just walking each step of the way that I can that's right in front of me, just like the poet that we quoted to begin tonight, it's like it's a daily step. It's a daily walk.
You know, I think that it's an important distinction too, because if you're, I know you gave a shout out to the UNCW basketball yesterday, but or tonight, the game last night. But if you're an athlete of any kind, you know the connection between your body and your mind. Like you know this. You know the connection between your attitude, and we have these built-in connections, but they're all connected. And a lot of times, what has happened is we sort of separate our emotions and our spiritual realities. And when you talk about stillness, when you talk about getting alone, there's rhythms, and this is all throughout the scriptures how these rhythms are to be a part of our lives. And I grew up in a youth group where we were just told to do our quiet time kind of every day. That's what you did. I often joke, you've heard me talk about this probably in here, that I started when I was probably 15 years old keeping a journal. And through college, it was hit or miss for sure, but it was definitely, there was a conscious attempt to do what you're doing, to come, listen to messages, to write things down, to try and process those things, and every day to read the Bible and try to write something down about what I was learning. And over the course of my life, I've learned, and kind of one of my mantras is I do my quiet time, spend time with God, I get still before the Lord, as though my life depends on it. And the reason is because I actually do believe that. Like I've come to realize how quickly I can go off the rails, or how prone I am in particular areas if I am not really focused. And it's the rhythms and the stillness that there just aren't shortcuts. There's not a quick fix, but it is a consistency of being able to say, I'm going to put myself in a position to take care of my mind, to take care of my heart, and to take care of even in my physical side as well, which most of you guys do that well, but it's these other two components that we sort of feel like if we have to tend to our minds or tend to our spirits or tend to those parts of our bodies, we're acting at a deficit, like something's wrong with us, instead of it just being actually what is needed or required of us to grow and become and all those things. Yeah. So it's a practice in that sense. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, I think.
Yeah,
is that right?
Good.
Yep.
And that leads us to the idea of renewal. Like it's this idea of renewing our minds consistently. And I think that even connects with like the idea of surrender intervals, like you talk about often, where it's like you surrender your life to God, and you pray the salvation prayer, or you kind of step into like a relationship with God, and then you go, okay, well, I blew it this afternoon. Does that you pray the salvation prayer all over again? And then you get up the next day and you get after it again. And it's like, it's the renewal pace is like every minute of every day is like, I'm constantly saying, all right, God, speak to me in this moment.
Yep.
Guide me in this conversation. This person just said this. Can you help me process it? Can you help me think about it? I was thinking about this earlier today. Oftentimes, if you're anything like me, the first thing that I open on my phone in the morning is Instagram. It's like your alarm goes off, you hit snooze a couple times, and then you get past that, and you open up Instagram, and you start to scroll. And then it's a load of emotions begin to get flooded into our minds of how do I process this bit of information? How do I process what this person said? Were they saying that to me? Was that a subtweet? On and on and on and on and on.
So this is what's interesting about sort of the geek out neurology part. Your brain starts to, starts to connect things.
Yeah.
So your brain always develops patterns. I don't know how many of you guys have experienced this, but if you ever type in something into Google, and you're looking for something and you type the first 4 letters in and Google hasn't figured out already what you want it to say, you're mad. You're typing in the first 4 letters, why doesn't it know what I'm doing? Because your brain basically says, you're having to work too hard for this. Google should know this. And because it doesn't know this, you're frustrated. Or if you've ever if you put your keys in the same place, every day, and then you can't find your keys and you have literally no idea where your keys are. And the reason is because you literally have no idea where your keys are, because it's a function that you've stopped thinking about, actively thinking about. Most of us do this when we drive. Some of you do this all the time when you drive, but when you drive, you're not thinking about everything that you have to do. Most of us turn our blinkers on without thinking about it. We hit the brake. I got to lift my foot off the right pedal and put it on the left pedal. You stop thinking about that stuff because you've done it so much, your brain does it automatically. And anything your brain starts to do automatically, it will just do automatically. So when you do Instagram, it learns, this is how I'm going to start my day. Or all these things develop patterns in our minds, which I think is what's so brilliant about when I talked to a psychiatrist probably 10 years ago. I did a series on mental health here. And the prep for it was I interviewed a bunch of psychologists and psychiatrists from our community and counselors and such, and just asked them a series of questions and just listened. Went to a bunch of lunches, had a bunch of meetings. And one of them said to me, he said, Mike, he said, you realize that what Paul wrote in the New Testament is some of those brilliant writings on psychiatry and psychology, the way he talks about things. Particularly in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, right? He says that we take every thought captive. And I bring this out every time I do something like this, because this is essentially what our thoughts look like. And just think about this, and we talk about this around here, but most of the time when something happens to you, whether it's, and I always use the example of when you're driving in your car and someone cuts you off. When you're driving your car and someone cuts you off and they cut you off, most of you, I assume, are relatively aggressive when that happens. You're not like, oh, I'm just glad to get my spot. Most of you kind of have some kind of, and what happens is you pull up and go, this guy cut me off, and then you begin to say he's an idiot, and you know what kind of mama raised him, and you know that they were a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and you got this whole drawn-out story about them, like literally instantly. And so if you're a guy or anybody and you see a girl on the beach, or you see a person who looks like they're sort of you're comparing yourself to, or whatever it is that you do, as soon as you see those things, you begin to construct a story, an arc. And it does it every single time without you giving it any permission. It just does it. Mm-hmm. So every time you see that image, or every time you see that thing or encounter that, it happens in your brain every single time, because you created a train of thought. And it all starts with the first one. So Paul says, I want you to take every thought captive. I want you to grab it. I want you to set it up and say, does this line up? Does this line up with what God says about me, what he says about the world, what he wants me to be and to know? And if it doesn't, then you got to get rid of it, right? And then you got to replace it with something else that's going to create a better train of thought. Like I've done this in a couple different places in my life. I used to have really bad road rage. And I don't much anymore, right? That's a fair statement.
Yeah. You drive about 35 in a 45. So.
I drive slow, but I remember thinking about this because Port City's, it's a pretty big church, and so people will see me out and they'll say hey to me, which is always very kind. But usually, like when people would ride my tail, because I drive slow, I drive like 45 miles an hour, I drive a really old car, and they ride my tail, I'm like, what is this idiot doing behind me? And I do the whole Steelers fan, I do the whole thing. And so what I decided to do, so then they get up beside you in the stoplight, when they tail you and they get beside you in the stoplight and you're all glad because you didn't get anywhere faster and you just want to look at them? That's what I wanted to do. So I remember thinking like, what if I take this first thought? Instead of thinking this person behind me is an idiot and they're in a hurry and they're trying to run me over, what if I think they probably just go to Port City and they think, oh, that might be Mike driving that old car in front of me. I want to pull up next to him and say, hey. Like, what if that is the story that you tell yourself in that moment? How differently do you think when they pull up next to me at the stoplight, how differently do you think that encounter is? You're like, hey. They're like, I want to fight you. And you're like, you go to Port City? Right? And it's all because you grabbed one thought. I wrote about this in my one word, taught this about blowing up a moment, because it's a pace thing. Most of this happens so quickly. And so when I was probably 22, 21 years old, I was just struggling with some thoughts. And what happened to me was I thought that because I thought this, I was a terrible person. Because these thoughts would pop in my brain, I began to think, oh gosh, that's what kind of person I am. And I stumbled on this reality that you can actually think your thoughts. It was a life-changing principle for me, that you can actually think about what you were thinking about. And so I remember trying to decide if I could take that first thought and I could replace it or switch it. And so like, I wrote about this. I remember very vividly where I was, and I thought, man, this thought path leads to death. This thought path is no good. But what if I could train every time I saw this thing, if I could replace it with something that God said or was true. And this is, again, 20, 30, almost 30 years ago. And I remember memorizing Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who does not sit in the seat of scoffers or stand in the path of sinners or walk in the way of the wicked, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates both day and night. And he will be like a tree that is planted by streams of living water, and his leaf will not wither, and in due season, right, he will flourish, and everything that he does will prosper. Now, so I memorized that. So every time I thought, or I was encountered with this temptation or this thought, instead of letting it go, this death spiral, I began to say, blessed is the man who does not stay here or make camp here. Rather, his delight is in something else, and in his law, he begins to really set his heart on. And I began to find these different stories. What I found is it took me about 6 months before there was equal competition between those two thoughts, between the ones that I would default kind of drift to and quoting this passage. What it is, it gave me hope. It gave me hope that I could actually train my thoughts. I could actually learn how to take a thought captive and stack it up. It's what Paul says. Did you just read this verse, or is it one up there now?
We can put it up there, Romans 12:2.
Yeah. This is what he says. He says, do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be transformed how? You can say it out loud. By the renewing of your mind. By stopping and inclining what you were thinking about in a direction that is towards, like Maddie, what you said, that is towards him. And trusting him. And what I want to be really careful of is I don't want to oversimplify this. Because this isn't just a matter of going, it's not what I'm talking about. It is simple, but it is insanely difficult. Mm-hmm. The reason is because there's a war. There's a war for your soul, for where you're going to give your allegiance and the life that you're going to live. So this is not like, I'm just going to have positive thoughts. It takes an enormous amount of effort, which is why you got to have people around you who know you and who you can say, hey, this is where I'm struggling. And this is what and not feel ashamed or feel bad or feel like because you think something, that's what you are, right? So I got to stop. That's why you get me so excited, because this is so important for you guys. Because
No, it's important. And I think just tagging off of you, can I see this?
You can have it.
Can I have it? Thanks. I was talking to one of my best friends last night, or a couple days ago, and we were talking about thoughts, and we were talking about what is this idea, because oftentimes mental health, sometimes you can't pinpoint where it comes from or why you have a thought, but some of you in this room have a very clear story about why you think the way that you do. Right. Mm-hmm. Something has been done, something has been said, and what I want to be very clear with is, yes, we take every thought captive, and this first thought is the thing, but sometimes this trajectory of thought, this story, was actually already written for you. And so what I want to be really clear is, if you're in the room going, wait, all of my thoughts right here are like crevices, and I cannot think anything different, I cannot believe anything different because I don't believe that I have worth. So if someone across the table, if we were having coffee and you said, I just don't believe I have worth, and I said, but you do. Well, what is that doing? Because you already have a narrative. You already have a story. And so what I think is so helpful in seeing this visual is that this story actually can be rewritten. This narrative that you've been told or that somebody told you can be rewritten. And that is, I can't even say that word, rewritten, because by the renewal of your thoughts. And so every time, I love how you took that first thought and you tossed it. And that's the idea, is that it's a crevice and it's a story. But hey, I caught it this time, and you know what? I don't believe it yet, but I'm going to say it, that I have worth, that God actually sees me as valuable. And then I'm going to say it again and again. Can I just do this? Until the whole thing is unraveled and the story is completely rewritten. Does that make sense? So it's not easy, and it's not overnight, but it is not your story forever, because that doesn't get the final word. That story is not it. It's just not. Sorry.
No, that's good.
I'm done. I got to clean this up.
No, you're...
And my OCD self is like really bothered, like how am I gonna get that thread back in
sorry.
these?
I'll do it for you later.
You're like, really? That's bad.
I'm sorry. I'll redo one. For real. Okay.
That thing has gotten messed up so many times. I think Jacob messed it up one
did.
time,
No,
didn't
no.
he? I think that something to add to that is the neurology of neuropathways. We talked a bit about this a little bit earlier today, but our brains are wired in a way that they are very, very efficient to where, and now I, by no means, like I said last week, I know very little about the brain. But as I've been reading and researching, you start digging into this, and it's when you start to see these neuropathways, it's like there's a crevice or a rut in your brain, and your brain is constantly going, I want to think the most efficient way. And the most efficient way is thinking what I've thought before.
Right.
Creating a new thought takes extra work. Somebody described it as a really thick section of woods, and to chop down a pathway into the wood line takes a lot of work. But driving on I-40 on cruise control doesn't take near as much work for our brain because it's paved and it's easy. And I think that idea of like, we've got to do a lot of really hard work.
Yeah.
And to your point, some of us in the room, maybe a lot of us in the room, have got to do a lot of work on thoughts that we are not responsible for in the means that we did not create them originally, but they still are our thoughts, which means we've got to have some tools. We've got to have people in our corner helping us come back to center, which I think, Mike, this is where you started talking about assigning your thoughts weight. And this idea, I believe, is life-changing in a lot of instances.
Yeah, let me ask everybody a question. How many of you guys have ever had a thought that scared you? All right, keep your hands up. Look around. Everybody in here has had something that popped in their brain that made them, could that be me? Could that be me? And what you've got to have is you've got to have something that counters that. Or else, right, that story has to be unwritten, or else it's going to continue to do what it's always done. And so, again, I want to be really careful not to oversimplify. I have, I'm not a disciplined person by nature. I was your age, and a lot of you are organized, you're studious, you're smart, you go to school. But I learned that I had to do things to keep me moving in a direction. So I started journaling. I cannot overstate how important that discipline has been for me. One of my mantras is, I write down my thoughts so that I can see what I am thinking without being blinded by what I'm feeling. I write down my thoughts so I can see what I am thinking without being blinded by what I'm feeling. Because sometimes what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling are in contrast with one another, and I've got to be able to see both of those things. I write my thoughts down to convince myself that I am not going to be a prisoner to the pace of my life. If I'm doing my quiet time and I can't get settled, I'll pull out my pen. And I don't do it on my computer or my phone. I do it with a pen, and I do it on paper because it gets all the notifications out of the way. But I'll write down of the verse that I'm reading just longhand. Because if you do that, it's like writing sentences when I don't think you write sentences when you were a kid, we did. But, I will not write on the bathroom walls ever again. You had to write the sentence 100 times. Yeah. And great shaming exercises from my childhood. And but my point is that it forces you to slow everything down. Because most of the information that you get and do is at a speed that is just outrageous. And it's not that we're bad or our culture's bad. Technology is great. It's just that we have to get ourselves in a position to do this better. So if I were taking notes, what I would write down is number one is I would say you can think your thoughts. That would be sort of freeing idea number one. You can think your thoughts, and you need to do it. You need to do it. When Jesus says something like, If you look at another person with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery with them. You need to think about what you think about that. And you need to have some really clear understanding on how you're going to process this. And do it with somebody, right? Get someone else in the conversation with you. What do you think Jesus means? Because he certainly can't mean that. He does. And then so you think your thoughts. And then number 2 is you assign those thoughts weight. You decide, does this thought get more weight than that thought? Does this thought carry more authority in my life than that thought does? Assign it a weight. This is what I think it means to take every thought captive and stack it up. It means that you actually get to make a distinction and assign a value. And what you'll learn is this, that beliefs are just weighty thoughts. For some of you, the reason you keep sabotaging your own relationships or your own way in the world is because you believe fundamentally that you aren't worthy of good things happening. And those thoughts, so you write them down, you have to figure out, okay, which one, if God says one thing and then you feel another, how are you going to give that weight? And what I also think you need to understand, and this is where I feel like the church or Christianity has made this, has oversimplified it, is we have not emphasized how hard it is to believe at times. To believe something that you don't feel can be true is really, really, really hard. My introduction to this, because you know I'm like anybody. I have some you know I have some really I always say I have a high idiot capacity. I have a great capacity to be an idiot. It is tempered by a lot of things: my wife, my kids, you know, Jesus, and so the reason that what's so important. I remember years ago, I was talking. We were at a smaller group. And we were talking about this, and he said this. The guy said this. He said, you know, when we are born again, when we are renewed and remade into the image of Christ, when we trust Him, we are made a new creature, right? That's what 2 Corinthians 5 says, that we are new creatures. That in that place, our hearts actually want what God wants. I remember going, not mine. Like, not mine. He's like, no, yes, it does. Like, yes, you do. There's just a lot of formative work that has to happen until you actually get to experience that and see that more fully. It was really, really small decisions along the way. Blowing up a moment when I'm going to choose this, I'm going to hold fast here. And a lot of times it required someone else kind of holding that when I wasn't able to see things in me and to believe things in me when I couldn't yet believe it for myself.
Yeah.
And so my point is that you need to give yourself some grace, that believing things that God says about you know, isn't always easy, especially when you've blown it, you know, an hour ago or 2 days ago. And what he keeps saying is, oh no, my mercies are new, my forgiveness is pervasive, it's sealed, my love for you is unshakable, my pursuit of you is relentless. And to go, God, I'm going to say this out loud, I'm going to believe this, I'm going to trust this, it takes work. It takes work. And I don't know how to say it any clearer than that.
Yeah. Well, and it takes community.
And community.
And that's why we believe so strongly that we belong together. That has become a center point of not only Overflow, but of as the church. Like it's woven into our vision statement that we want to do life with God together. Like we can't do this apart. We've got to be together. And I think that that's why, like, we're pushing so hard into when we ask you to make us a promise to invite somebody in. Because I feel like I have a conversation once a week with some of my friends where they're like, no one knows this. I'm struggling with this, and I'm full of shame about it, and it's super painful to me, but I haven't had the courage to be able to bring somebody in yet. And that's one of the lead objectives of this series, of just having this conversation, is for us to be people that say, I'm not gonna hold it in the dark anymore. I'm gonna invite somebody else into the conversation. And this church is a beautiful place. It's a wonderful place for you to invite somebody in. Do y'all have any closing thoughts to the conversation?
No, I hope you walk away from this feeling like we didn't just give you a bunch of solutions and a bunch of easy half answers, because that's not our goal. Our goal is to normalize this kind of conversation among the body of Christ, and in this family and in this room and in community groups. And I hope you hear from me and from Carson and from Dad that I love you guys.
Yeah.
Like, I do not want to see this war win. I don't want to see the war in your mind win, because God ultimately has the victory, and we know that. We know that to be true. But y'all, it's a battle. It's a battle to be fought, and we're in that battle with you. And so if you feel that constant tension of my mind is racing and I have no control and my thoughts are out of control, so when you say take your thoughts captive, I don't do that. I cannot do that. I want to tell you the answer isn't just simple. The answer is, hey, we have resources and we have people who can be in your corner, because we know the war has been won, right? But it's a battle. And we're in it with you. And so if that's where you're at, that is okay. And I'm glad you're here. And then I'm like the spectrum of people, right? Like, there's so many different stories in this room, and I wish I could go through and talk about them all. But what I want you to hear is you're not alone, and you're safe here. You're safe to bring whatever you've got to the light in this room. And I cannot promise perfection, because I would be fooling myself if that was the case. But I will promise that we will be present with you, and when we're not, God is. When we're not, He is. And He holds victory. And I could not, if I could put that on a banner and just raise it over you guys, I would. Because He holds it, and He holds you. And when you don't think you're seen in this, you are seen by a God who knows every detail about you. And it's hard to believe. And it takes time to really begin to let sink in. But if that's one thing I am so serious about, it's that.
That's good, Maddie. I would just add, not add. I think one of the things that sin does, and Satan tells you that when you have these kind of secrets, these places, it says, oh, if anybody found out about this, it would be the end of you. And what I think you got to realize is that, what might be the end is if nobody finds it out. Like, you need to tell someone. You need to say it. You need to let someone else in. One of my life, I don't have life verses per se, but one of my kind of mantras comes from Proverbs. And it says, above everything else, guard your heart. Above everything else that you're to do, you need to guard your heart. Because out of it flows the well springs of your life, flows the very essence of who you are. And the way you guard your heart is by engaging in the battle of your mind. And to be gracious with yourself, to just what Carson said, you got to promise you can't quit. You got to get somebody else involved. And what was the third one?
Go easy.
Oh yeah, you got to give yourself grace. There is hope. There is hope for you to be formed into the image that God has created you to be, for you to experience fullness and freedom in your life. And it's the promise that Carson read at the beginning. confident in this very thing, that he who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it.
Yeah.
He's faithful to do it.
Yeah.
And he invites us to trust him.
Yeah. That's good. Mike, Maddie, thank you very much. Overflow, can we just tell them thank you for being here? You're good. I really believe in what we're talking about. And if you leave here tonight with one thing, one action item, one next step, one thing that you can do maybe tonight or tomorrow or Thursday is to get really, really honest. Find somebody that you trust. This church is full of people that are trustworthy. And after the gathering tonight, some of our care interns are going to be down front. Some of our staff will be down here. We would love to be a place where you say, I'm taking what has been in the dark and I'm bringing it into the light. I don't know exactly how the conversation is going to feel. I don't exactly know what my next step is. I don't know exactly how I'm going to experience victory. But I'm stepping in to what God is calling me to do. And that should just come close. Or why don't you stand with me real quick before we jump into worship. And I would love to read something over us in the Message translation of the Bible that Eugene Peterson helped translate. There's so many different places that when we really begin to dig in and we begin to read, it just brings it into a language that I just believe that is so simple for us to resonate with. And when we look in the book of 2 Samuel, we see a lot about the life of a guy named David. And David had some really high moments that we love to talk about in church. He had a lot of victories, but he had a lot of low moments. He did some really crazy things. And he writes throughout the Psalms places where he felt extremely far from God. He felt very full of shame. He didn't know what his next step might be. And in the book of Samuel records it so well. And the Message translation really brings this to life. And I think this is what it looks like for us to step into a posture of worship, not only tonight, but in our life at large. He says, David writes, God made my life complete when I placed all of the pieces before him. When I cleaned up my act, he gave me a fresh start. Indeed, I've kept alert to God's ways, and I haven't taken God for granted. And every day I review the way that he works. I try not to miss a trick. I feel put back together, and I'm watching my step. And this next part is so beautiful. He says, God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to his eyes. When God sees those places that we are afraid to talk about, he brings redemption, he brings love, he brings empathy, bringing the war of despair to a close, saying, hey child, I know you by name, and I care for you. And that mental struggle that you've never told anybody before, I know it, and I love you all the more. And David goes on, he says, everyone who runs towards him makes it. Is there any God like God? And when we worship, when we sing, when we raise our hands, when we stand in this room on Tuesday nights and in this room on Sunday mornings, we are practicing this idea of confession, not in confession of the sense of I've got to get all the bad things out, but in God, I'm confessing that you are Lord. I'm confessing that you are good. And maybe I don't fully believe that right now, but I'm working to believe it. And I'm going to just take the step that's right in front of me to believe it, because I'm trusting David, that all that David went through when he said, everyone who runs towards him, he makes it. Because Jesus, when he walks into your life, he wants to do a new thing. And the first song that we're singing tonight is about the story of where Jesus turned water into wine. He took something that was plain and turned it into something that is recorded to be the best wine at the wedding. That's what he wants to do with your life. He wants to take something that feels confusing, that feels hard, that feels difficult, and he wants to speak life into it. And he wants to breathe his love and affection into you. So that is Jesus, who we are about to worship together. Let's pray together. Jesus, thank you for the conversation that we were able to have tonight. And thank you that you are constantly redeeming the world that we live in. Thank you for the words of David that point us to just run towards you, because everyone who runs towards you makes it. God, I pray that we would run tonight, that we would worship with everything that we are. God, I ask for the person in the room who's standing here right now going, Carson, I don't connect with worship. I don't know that I believe all the things that are about to be on the screen. I don't know how to process the idea of faith or the idea of God. God, I pray that they would just feel comfortable in this room over the next few minutes, that they would feel cared for by this church, and that they would feel seen and cared for, especially by you. God, help us to sing a new song tonight in our life. God, help us to usher in your presence and receive your love, maybe like we never have before. God, we love you, and we say this in your name. Amen.